This day, 106 years ago, the family and household of the last Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, were killed in the basement of the Apatiev house in Yekaterinburg. After the February Revolution and the subsequent abdication of Tsar Nicholas II in 1917, the Romanov family and servants were kept as political prisoners in the Alexander Palace. They were then moved to Tobolsk before being moved to the Ural Mountains in Yekaterinburg. This move had been orchestrated by Yakov Yurovsky, who had been acting under the orders of Vladimir Lenin. He was essentially given the task of being the watchdog of the family along with a number of appointed guards. He moved the family to the Apatiev house in Yekaterinburg, which was otherwise known as the House of Special Purpose. According to Dr. Helen Rappaport, a statement in the local newspaper made by the Bolshevik war commissar said that those being kept inside the house were kept as hostages. And that quote, "The slightest attempt at counter-revolutionary action in the town will result in the summary execution of the hostages." Just after midnight on July 17, 1918, the family's physician, Dr. Botkin, was informed by Yurovsky that they would need to prepare to move. The reason for this move being that the imposing White Army were drawing closer to the house. While the family were packing their belongings, their guards were preparing their weapons. When the time came, Yurovsky invited them all downstairs into the basement of the house. The Tsarina asked for chairs for herself and her son while they were waiting. Yurovsky's assistant, Grigory Nikulin, made a joke to Yurovsky that, quote, "The heir wants to die in a chair." As the family waited for instructions on what to do next, a group of armed men entered the room led by Yurovsky. He read aloud the following statement, quote, "In the fact that your relatives continue their offensives against Soviet Russia, the Presidium of the Ural Regional Soviet has decided to sentence you to death." Nicholas, completely taken aback, reacted with shock and surprise. He was then shot point blank and killed first among the party. Alexandra followed shortly after. Of everyone in the room, they suffered the easiest deaths. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that most of the execution squad probably would have been assigned specific targets. However, it's possible that because Nicholas was shot multiple times, that many people gave up on their targets because they wanted to claim that they were the ones that had shot the Tsar. And after the first round of firings, the room quickly filled up with smoke. The guards stepped out for a moment to breathe some fresh air, but when they entered, they found that many of their targets were still alive. One thing that may have prolonged the deaths of the family, particularly the women, while the family were packing, they were carefully sewing family jewels into their clothing and various items like pillows, which in some ways provided protection from the bullets, but not necessarily in the way that people would expect. Some people imagine this as something of a prototype bulletproof vest. But according to Dr. Rappaport, it's more likely that the impact caused by the bullets would have sent the jewels into the torsos of the women. This ultimately ended up making the process of their deaths much more prolonged and painful. Many of the guards had to take to blunt force and bayonets to finish off their targets. The entire ordeal, which was meant to last only 30 seconds, lasted nearly 20 minutes. And it was said that the ground was so covered in gore that it was slippery. Bodies were then moved into the back of a truck while one person was tasked with cleaning up the scene, using sawdust to soak up the blood. The truck drove about 12 miles away to a small village to dispose of the bodies in a mine shaft, but they then realized that the mine shaft would be too shallow. They then attempted to collapse the mine with grenades. After this didn't give the desired result, they took the bodies moved to Prosinakov log. Bodies were then splashed with acid to further hide their identities. They were then placed in a shallow grave. The ground was also covered with railroad ties, and the truck drove back and forth over them in order to embed the ties further into the ground. The bodies of the servants and their families wouldn't be located for over 60 years. In 1979, two amateur archaeologists began a private exhumation. They used records detailed by Yurovsky of where the truck had broken down. They quickly found evidence of bodies, but they kept the location secret for over a decade. Then in 1991, once the political climate was safer to exhume the bodies, further investigation took place with more people. Hundreds of bones were discovered, along with various other items that would allow for forensic reconstruction to take place. And they called on the international community of DNA experts to help them make the forensic reconstructions. From there, they determined that 5 female bodies and 4 male bodies had been found. Among the group, there was a mother, a father, and 3 daughters, along with 4 unrelated people. This, however, meant that there were still 2 children missing. And famously, Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, had donated some of his DNA samples to help identify the bodies. The skeletons of the family and household that had been identified were buried in a special ceremony in 1998. However, the search continued for Alexei and one of the daughters, most likely Maria. Search Foundation then began a task force to find the missing children, with search standing for Scientific Expedition to account for the Romanov children. And it was finally in 2007 that the last 2 bodies were found. These 2 bodies still have yet to be buried with their families and are currently being held in an archival facility.